Hello, dreamers, and welcome to the latest episode of California Dreaming. My apologies for taking an extra week to get this episode out to you. I just been kind of going through some stuff. I will tell you more about it a little bit later on. It's not earth-shattering, it's not tragic, it's not anything. It's pretty lame, but it has been dragging me down. It's kind of killed my motivation for a while, but here I am. So, a couple of notes about the show before we get started. This is an independent, ad-free podcast, which means I depend on you, the listeners, to keep this thing moving along, and there are a number of things that you can do to help make that happen. You can leave a nice rating and a review on whatever app you are listening on right now. You can recommend the show in true crime discussion groups and forums, but only if the recommendation makes sense. If someone's asking for recommendations for a true crime podcast where the host is consistent, well-spoken, and makes sense, then this might not be the show for them. You can follow California Dreaming on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Like, comment, share, retweet, spread the word. And if you have a little bit of spare change laying around each month, you can subscribe to California Dreaming's Patreon. Starting at just $1 a month, you will enjoy all the perks, including dozens of exclusive full-length bonus episodes. You'll get a shout-out on a future episode. You'll get a thank you card, an actual, real-life, handwritten thank you card, with some small tokens of my gratitude enclosed within the envelopes, depending on which level you subscribe at. And of course, as always, I'll be sending you my undying love. And for once, I did exactly what I was going to do, and I got caught up on every single thank you card during the week of 4th of July and the week afterwards. Many of you who subscribed in the last 6 months or so should have already gotten a card from me by now or should be getting it very soon. And to Tiffany F., I did get the package with the magazine. I apologize for not reaching out sooner. Like I said in the beginning, I'm kind of going through it, but I'm getting through it. But thank you. Thank you so much for sending that. Once I get my life on track, which is probably going to be never, I intend to frame that article. So anyway, thank you again. And I know that there is another one floating around somewhere in Scotland trying to make its way to me. So when I get that one, hopefully get that one. I'll probably frame that one too. We'll see. All right. Now, another quick note before I move on. If you are a patron or even a former patron and you never ever received a thank you card from me, it might be because y'all did something wrong and it's all your fault. Even so, I'll be more than happy to help you fix it. Some of you chose to opt out of receiving mail, and some of you may have not realized that you opted out. You just go into your account and add your mailing information and then send me a message so that I know that you made those changes. The only way that I send anything out is if I get email notifications that one of you made a move on your Patreon account. I get emails if you join, if you make changes like raising your pledge or going annual, or if you send me a message or a comment on a post. I don't get notifications if your credit cards get declined or if you change your address or things like that. So you have to message me or comment on a post in Patreon in order for an email to be sent to me. That way I can click on it and get redirected to your account, and I get your mailing information and I send off your mail, and that's how that works. So anyways, I have all the cards done for now, except if you joined or did something on Patreon in the last couple weeks. I'm going to try to be more diligent about keeping up with it. You know how I can be. And if you make a one-time donation through PayPal, I can send you thank you cards as well, but you just have to include your mailing information when you attach a message to your donation. Some of you who donate through PayPal do put your address, some of you don't. Just know it's an option. All right, that's it for all that stuff. Let's get to today's story. So, what prompted me to want to take a look at this particular story all the way over in the state of Maryland was an incident that occurred recently at my home. Some of you remember that a couple of years back on a Sunday around noon, my dogs, started aggressively barking at the front door. I kind of tried to glance out the window to see who it was, and it sort of looked like a delivery person. But to try and figure out what he was there for, I ended up cracking the door open a little bit so the dogs wouldn't run out, of course. And it was at that point that this man at the door tried to push his way through. And I managed to shove the door shut, like I shouldered the door and then deadbolted it, at which point I called 911. And it turned out the guy was pretty out of it. He was lost or at the wrong address or whatever. The police officers trespassed him, and all has been quiet ever since. That is until a couple of Saturday mornings ago. I got up early for work that day. It was 4 a.m. and it was, I believe it was right before the 4th of July, the Saturday before July 4th. I usually open the front door and I let the dogs onto the balcony where I have a patch of artificial grass for them to do their business on. And I keep a doggy gate up to block the staircase. And I have it secured to the balcony railings with bungee cords so that the wind doesn't blow it down. And normally Ricky, my little Pomeranian mix of the three, he's the only one who loves to jump out of bed and go outside at that ungodly hour. The other two, not so much. But on this morning, to my surprise, all three of them went to the front door for me to let them out. When I did, they ran outside and immediately began barking. I thought maybe it was a cat, but I don't want them making so much noise at that time. It's very early on a Saturday morning. But when I looked to my left, I saw two people standing at the top of my staircase trying to undo my bungee cords. The person closer to me was a woman, and the person to her left was a man, and they were both dressed nice, and they looked like they had just come from a night of partying. And it took me a second to wrap my head around what I was seeing because I literally just rolled out of bed. I tried to recognize them as neighbors, but I really didn't know who they were. I didn't say anything to them, and the weird thing is they didn't say anything to me either when they saw me. There was nothing like, "Oh wow, we don't know you. This must not be the place we're looking for. Sorry to bother you." There was none of that. The woman just kept working on getting my bungee cord unhooked. Everybody struggles with my bungee cords, even in the daytime, so I imagine it was even harder to do it at night. So I quickly brought the dogs back inside. I put them in the bedroom. I armed myself with some pepper spray and a knife with intentions of spraying the both of them with my left hand and stabbing at them with my right if I had to. And I stood at the door listening for maybe another 30 seconds, but they still weren't saying anything and they didn't seem to be leaving. I could see them pacing around on the balcony and they tried opening the door and knocking. And so it was at that point I called 911, and they stayed on the balcony for the majority of my phone call, but by the time the police had arrived, they had already left. So the second time around kind of bothered me more over the days and the week or so following the incident because I still don't know who these people were. The police didn't see them to find out if they were just at the wrong apartment. I just didn't get a resolution like I did the first time around. The first time also happened in the middle of the day, but 4 a.m., that's the time we talked about in the University of Idaho murders as the perfect time. Nothing good ever happens at 4 in the morning. I also came real close and face to face with these people the other night, and luckily the dogs listened for once and came back inside right away. And it's also a good thing that I had that doggy gate up and held it in place with bungee cords. Otherwise, that couple would have made it onto the balcony a heck of a lot faster. So, following the second incident that just happened, and how we've been talking about the University of Idaho murders prior to this episode, and how we talked a little bit about how the killer got in through an unlocked sliding glass door, it just has been weighing heavily on my mind. And it's such a small thing that could have made a world of difference if that sliding door had been locked. Since that night, I've taken a few measures. I installed a Ring doorbell. I got more pepper spray. I got a baseball bat. So I'm ready for the next time someone gets lost and ends up on my balcony. In the meantime, you notice that I took about 3 weeks off. And like I told you, I had filled out and mailed so many thank you cards to patrons. It took a lot longer than I thought it would, but I got it done. However, there have been some of you who have trickled in, and I will get to you a lot sooner than I did last time. I set up this whole new way of me making these thank you cards, which is meant to be a little bit more efficient and easy for me to go to it on a daily basis instead of having to drag everything out of storage and in my closet and take up my dining room table for 5 days. So I think I finally got it down, and only after 6 years. So what was my point? Oh yeah. So as I was doing those thank you cards, I was listening to podcasts, and this story that I'm going to talk to you about today began playing in my ear. And it's about this killer. I would even go so far as to say a serial killer, all the way over in the state of Maryland, that caught my attention. This is the story that we hear about. This story, stories like the University of Idaho, that will have us double checking our doors and windows at night. This is our 270th episode of California Dreaming, a vacation series out of the beautiful state of Maryland, the tale of the mother-daughter killer, Jason Thomas Scott. On a summer evening in August of 2008, in Prince George's County, Maryland, located pretty much right next to Washington, D.C., a resident named Lloyd Irvin had dozed off on his sofa when he was suddenly awoken by 2 men standing over him, pointing guns at him. One of the intruders said, "You're being robbed. Don't move." Also at home at the time was Lloyd's wife, Vicky, and their son, who was only 4 years old at the time. Well, it just so happened that Lloyd was a highly skilled and renowned martial arts expert. So when one of the armed intruders walked away to go look around the house, Lloyd took that opportunity to try and lunge onto the guy who was supposed to be in control of their victim. Lloyd managed to get the gun away from him, while at the same time was able to get the gun cartridge to release and drop to the ground. As soon as that happened, the intruder ran out of the room yelling at his accomplice that he has the gun, meaning the homeowner and the intruder fought over the gun and the homeowner won. And when he went onto the ground to try and quickly reload it, the 2 intruders made their way out of the house and were long gone. But this home invasion would be one of more than 24 home invasion burglaries that suddenly began happening in Prince George's County, Maryland. And all of them were very similar. There were 2 men wearing masks who went to great lengths to not leave any kind of evidence that could be linked back to them, as this wave of home invasions really had local police stumped, and the community was very worried. More and more so as the days and weeks went on with no leads and no suspects. A little less than 6 months after the break-in at the Irvin home, on January 26, 2009, Prince George's County 911 received a desperate call for help from a home in Upper Marlboro. The caller was a teenage girl, and she said, "Ma'am, I've been shot. Me and my mom have been shot. I'm bleeding to death." The caller was 16-year-old Carissa Lofton, and she wasn't wrong. She was, in fact, bleeding to death. By the time first responders arrived at the house, both Carissa, the caller, and the other victim in the home, her mom, 45-year-old Karen Lofton, were both dead. Each of them with an execution-style gunshot wound to the head. The front door was locked, deadbolted from the inside, and so the initial thought was whoever carried out this double murder may have crawled through an unlocked window. Either way, another early thought was that these murders could possibly be related to the string of home invasion robberies that have plagued the county for several months by then. But it did not appear that anything had been taken from the house. Karen's vehicle was still parked in the driveway, valuables were untouched, and nothing was ransacked. And when it came to physical evidence, the killers were very careful about not leaving any trace of them behind. But they did leave behind 6 shell casings from the gunshots that killed Karen and Carissa. And that weapon, it was determined to have been a Glock 17. The only other bit of evidence that investigators had to point to was one neighbor having reported seeing a blue vehicle parked about 2 houses down from where the murders happened. And that is all investigators had to go on at the onset of this case. So in an effort to further the investigation along, detectives first started to take a closer look at the personal lives of their victims to see if there was anything that stood out that might give them an idea of why these two may have been chosen as murder victims. Karen Lofton was described as a single mom who was not only devoted to her children, but also to her job as a registered nurse, and who, by all accounts, had not an enemy in the world. Karen and Carissa's dad, Kirkland, had been long divorced, but Carissa was still very close to him, even though he lived nearly 10 hours away down in Atlanta, Georgia. Carissa held a very special place in Kirkland's life because she did have a rough go at it in the beginning. When she was still very young, she had to have open heart surgery. I'm not sure what that was to correct, but according to her dad, Carissa bounced back from that surgery stronger than ever. As she got older, Carissa developed a passion for modeling and fashion, like plenty of teenagers do. And just like that, her life was over. The first place to start for a case like this that has very little to go on in the way of leads for these investigators would be to speak to close family members to see if there is anyone related to the victims that might have a reason for something like this to happen, or perhaps they have some information about who may have done this. Carissa had an older brother named Keon, who, at the time that she and their mother were shot to death, was 20 years old. He resided there in the same home with his mom and his sister, but at the time of the killings and when police began to arrive at the scene, he wasn't there. A few hours after the murders, police noticed him standing nearby the scene, and he apparently did not make his presence known or go up to any of the officers asking what was going on at his family's house. Like I said, Keon did not approach the officers and identify himself. He was spotted and recognized and then detained for questioning. The things about this case that were confusing are if the Lofton's murders were related to the recent rash of home invasions, then why did this one go so bad? Why was nothing taken? They knew for a fact that whoever it was that entered the home did in some capacity break into the house because they set off the alarm. But just a few seconds later, the alarm was turned off by someone entering the alarm code. and that's when police wanted to have some answers from Keon, the victim's son and brother. He was the only other person who lived in the home that would have had that alarm code. He was allegedly somewhere else when the killings took place, but then showed up at the crime scene, but did not identify himself. Keon went through a barrage of questioning, and investigators were able to eliminate him as a suspect. He had spent the evening at his girlfriend's house. Both his girlfriend and her mom were able to corroborate Keon's alibi. Their father, Kirkland, and his alibi that he was in Atlanta at the time of the killings was also verified as well. Another person close to the Loftons that investigators brought in for questioning was a former boyfriend of Karen's named Michael Lacey. And they ended up bringing him in for questioning on 3 different occasions because of his refusal to submit to a polygraph examination, which seems like a smart move on his part because a polygraph feels like one of those things that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. No matter which direction you go, if you take it and fail, it looks bad. If you refuse to take it, it looks bad. If you take it and pass, it doesn't automatically make you look good. But in the end, investigators were able to eliminate Karen's former boyfriend as having anything to do with her and Carissa's murders. With people close to the family having been ruled out as suspects, investigators were still standing around on square one, when just 6 weeks later, it happened again. Prince George's County's murder count ticked up another 2 spots on March 16, 2009. But before we get to this next set of murders, let's rewind a little bit and take a look at an event that seemed at first totally unrelated. Just a block or 2 away from where Carissa and Karen had been murdered, and about a month and a half later, another resident called to report that when she had just arrived home, she found that her Nissan Maxima had been stolen out of her carport. And while she was actually on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, the caller saw her car being driven right past her at a high rate of speed. And despite police mobilizing pretty quickly to try and cut off that vehicle's path of travel, it had already slipped past any places police were able to set up a traffic stop. But it would only be a short time later, before the sun would rise once again, that investigators would find that stolen Maxima. A fire burning outside a vacant home was reported by a neighbor. As it would turn out, the thing that was on fire was that very stolen Nissan Maxima, and it was only going to get worse. Once the fire was put out and they were able to look inside the vehicle, it was only then that they discovered there were 2 completely charred bodies inside the trunk. It would later be determined that the victims were another mom and her daughter, 42-year-old Dolores DeWitt, and her daughter, 19-year-old Ebony DeWitt. Another thing that the victims had in common, like Karen, Dolores was also a nurse. She was also a single mom, providing for 2 children. The evening before Dolores and Ebony were found burning inside that vehicle, Ebony had gone out with her boyfriend. They had gone to dinner. He described everything as having gone just fine. Ebony was wearing her favorite blue sweater. And after dinner, her boyfriend drove her home, and he watched her as she walked in through the front door and into her house. That was the last that he had seen of her. And after running through all the other usual people to talk to, when it came to this second case of a mother-daughter double murder in such close proximity to the first one, it left investigators having to consider that both of the cases were in danger of growing cold if they didn't come up with some leads or information. And they also had to begin to consider the notion that perhaps these 2 murders were related. Despite the little information investigators had with these 2 double murders in the time span of 6 weeks, they couldn't help but think that the 2 crimes had to be related, even though there were some significant differences with the 2 crimes. In the first set of murders, the victims were shot, In the second set of murders, they were strangled. In the first set of murders, the victims were killed and left where they lay. In the second murders, it was determined that the victims had been dead for about 24 hours prior to being set on fire. And in addition to that, the second set of victims were taken from the place where the crime had started, placed into the trunk of a stolen car, dumped at a vacant house that was for sale, and set on fire. Investigators weren't able to tell if the victims were killed at the house or at the place where they were found. It was a lot more trouble the killers went through the second time around than they did the first time. Despite those differences, it was hard to overlook the very big coincidence of two sets of victims, both being mother and daughter, murdered together, literally in each other's own backyards. Where the car was found burning with the DeWitt's bodies inside the trunk, that was actually only 2 blocks away from where the Loftons had been shot to death inside their house. There was also the coincidence that they were both single moms and both were nurses. Investigators were going to have to widen their search. People who were close to the victims were pretty quickly eliminated as suspects. When it came to the second set of victims, Dolores and Ebony, investigators spoke to some of Dolores' exes. She had an ex-husband, but the investigation further revealed that Dolores also dated women. And when it came to Dolores' exes, the 2 most recent both had their alibis that also checked out. Both of her exes took the polygraph. They both passed. Investigators ran through their background information. There was nothing alarming, no red flags. And they both were where they said they were at the time that the murders took place. Another thing that was similar to the break-in at the Loftons' home was that there did not appear to be any sign of forced entry into the house. But there was, like at the Loftons, an unlocked window on the side of the house, and the killer or killers managed to leave their house without leaving any physical or trace evidence behind that would be useful in tying someone to these murders. And the car didn't have very much evidence to be collected in it either. The fire nearly completely destroyed Dolores and her daughter, with the exception of a small section of the jeans that Dolores was wearing the day that she was killed. Also attached to what was left of Dolores' jeans were bits and pieces of leaves that had come from a beech tree, which would not have been unusual if there had been some beech trees anywhere around, but there weren't. When the autopsies revealed that Ebony and Dolores had been dead at least 24 hours before being placed into the trunk of that car to be burned, that only added to the number of questions that were piling up pretty quickly. Where were Dolores and Ebony during those 24 hours prior to being set on fire? Where would someone be keeping 2 dead bodies for an entire day? When you lay it all out, it looks and sounds really risky to go and murder 2 people, to take both of their bodies out of the house that they were attacked in, to drive them to a second location, stealing that Nissan Maxima, which got called on pretty quickly, so quickly that the victim actually saw her car driving away at some point during the call, right? Then going back to the first car with the stolen car, putting 2 bodies inside the trunk, and then possibly even going past the house that they had just stolen that car from again, because that could have been what was happening at the exact same time the stolen car was being reported to 911 and the caller said, "Hey, there's my car." And then they went and parked it in the driveway of a vacant home that was for sale, and then they went through the trouble of setting the car on fire to a point that burned so intensely that almost everything inside of it was destroyed, and then casually strolled away from the scene. And for investigators on the case, they didn't know what to make of all this. Some days it seemed like they needed to possibly admit to themselves that they might just have a serial killer on their hands. There are just too many coincidences to overlook. Other days it felt like that they had 2 different cases, 2 different double killings, 2 different murderers. It would only be a matter of time before the pieces of the puzzle would start to come together for the investigators on these cases. You know how they say that the devil is in the details? And from the sounds of it, authorities in Prince George's County, Maryland, they were going to have to take a few steps back and start looking at the bigger picture in terms of what exactly they had on their hands here. Beginning in the summer of 2008 in their jurisdiction, they suddenly had this rash of home invasion burglaries, stolen cars, now a series of murders. It was the timing of everything that seemed to link all the crimes together. They've got what they suspect to be at least 2 people terrorizing their community. There has to be some way of connecting these dots. Well, a break in the case finally came along when investigators ran across some information about the owner of the Nissan Maxima, the one that was being reported stolen at the same time that the owner saw whoever it was that stole it driving right past her, and was later found engulfed in flames with the bodies of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt in the trunk. Well, in speaking to the owner of the Nissan, she reported that it was about a month before her car was stolen that her home had also been broken into. And while she did call the police to report the break-in, at the time she didn't notice anything had turned up missing in her house. But since then, her car had been stolen and subsequently set on fire and pretty much destroyed. It was then the owner of the Nissan suddenly noticed that she was in fact missing something, the spare set of keys from her now burnt out Maxima. So now investigators readjusted their focus and became interested in seeing if they could figure out who it was that broke into the Nissan Maxima owner's house a month earlier. Then they would be able to find the person who probably stole the spare set of car keys. And that would take you to the person quite possibly who was driving the stolen vehicle. And having that information might just bring investigators within reach of their killer, or at least someone who is well acquainted with the killer that might be able to lead police right to him. So what police did next basically was a sweep of the neighborhood surrounding the home where the Nissan was stolen. When all was said and done, more than 200 people were brought into the police department for questioning. And more than 200 people walked out of the police station, not having been able to bring investigators any closer to solving their cases. As it was becoming more and more apparent that police were grasping at straws, the community continued to become increasingly uneasy about there not being any suspects or any arrests in the case of the mother-daughter murders. Days, weeks, and soon months began to pass, with police having few answers to their growing lists of questions. In July of 2009, a little more than a year since the home invasion burglaries began, investigators working these 4 murders received a tip. This time, it wasn't from the public, but rather from some federal agents. ATF agents had recently taken into custody 2 people who were suspected of selling stolen guns. After interrogating the 2 suspects, the agents began to make the connection that at least one of them may have something to do with the string of break-ins in Prince George's County. It was mostly just a hunch after talking to the guy, and his name was Jason Thomas Scott. And while the list of coincidences in this case gets even longer after we're introduced here to one Jason Scott. As it turned out, Jason lived 2 blocks away from the home where Dolores and Ebony were living at the time that they were murdered. That's pretty darn close. To have this case boil down to a guy that happened to be in a random conversation with the ATF, and then all of a sudden, this federal agent thinks he might know a little something about the break-ins, so he passes the information on to the county authorities, only for them to figure out that he lived a couple of blocks over from 2 of their murder victims. Could be a coincidence, but with not very much else to go on, it was worth a closer look. So when I first started looking at Jason Scott's various pictures or mugshots, whatever you want to call them, there wasn't anything about him that stood out to me as anything beyond just a normal looking guy. But when investigators began describing being in the room with him and what his voice sounded like, what he was like as a person. In general, they called him a pipsqueak, just a little man with a weak voice. In fact, it was the Prince George's County detective on the case that said the guy wouldn't even speak up to talk to him in a normal voice range. He whispered, and it seemed like he was doing everything he could to come across as meek as possible. He wasn't exactly what everyone had in mind when they thought of someone capable of killing 2 moms and their teenage daughters. The detective wasn't even sure if this lead was worth anything, or if this guy was someone who could even be considered such a violent murderer. The ATF agents who were the ones working on the stolen weapons case, they also had a hard time figuring out exactly what they had here with this guy, Jason Scott. For agents who have encountered some pretty violent and high-profile suspects in their careers, they too were having a difficult time seeing Jason Scott as being a hardened criminal. He did not fit the bill. He was generally an intelligent individual. He had graduated from college and was well-liked and a well-respected employee at UPS. When they dove into his criminal history, there was literally nothing there. When Jason Scott was taken into custody on the stolen weapons charges, he was arrested along with a gentleman by the name of Marcus Hunter, a person who has been described as Jason's accomplice, who also has no criminal history in his background to speak of either. And because of their relatively clean criminal records, after they were hit with those weapons charges, they were released on OR while they awaited trial, though it was required for them to be kept on home monitoring. The ATF agents did go with their gut instincts when it came to Jason Scott because they were fairly certain that he had more to do with the crime wave that had been going on in Prince George's County that began in the summer of 2008 than he was first letting on. But the federal agents were responsible for working their stolen weapons case, and they were pretty sure that he had more accomplices helping him with that as well. And after sizing this Jason Scott guy up, the agents got it into their minds that this is a guy who would not have a problem throwing someone else under the bus in order to save his own skin. And if there was some sort of deal or plea bargain to be offered to him, he would jump at the chance to take it if it meant that he could place the blame onto somebody else. So what the federal agents decided to do was to see if they could strike a deal with Jason in order to just get him to start talking, because he was not talking. And what they offered him was a thing we've heard about, I believe, at least once before in this show, and it's called the King for a Day deal. What this deal between the prosecutor and the suspect is where the suspect has a certain window of time to say whatever it is that he wants to say, even confessions to crimes. And nothing that he says can be used in a prosecution against him. Effectively, Jason Scott has been given the chance to admit to whatever is weighing heavily on his mind, no matter how bad, and nothing he says can be used against him in a court of law. For some reason, the 2 times that I've heard this tactic being used, investigators had it in their mind that their scheme would work on the certain kind of criminals that just really love talking about themselves and their crimes. But there is a massive loophole or two in this deal, and this is where having an attorney is helpful, or at least I would think it's helpful, to make these loopholes clear to everyone before they sign up for this King for a Day deal. There are always going to be nuggets of information that investigators can take and run with, because remember, the only thing that prosecutors can't do is use the person's own statements against them. But if they can prove a case without your statements, they can still prosecute you for it. There is nothing in the deal that says they can't use other evidence against you. The only thing they can't use are your own words. So once a suspect decides to go ahead and dish on all these crimes that they think they're going to confess to and get away with, once these guys start talking, it's like the investigators are hoping that they won't be able to bring themselves to shut themselves up. And if I'm not mistaken, It all has to be the truth and nothing but the truth. Otherwise, it makes the deal invalid, but I'm not completely 100% sure on that last part. Anything a suspect says, whether it's a confession or not, can be useful in triggering new leads and things that might tie into other more serious cases. Yeah, so Jason Scott might be thinking he's got a good deal out of this, because what he really wanted out of all of this was to get as buddy-buddy as possible as he could with the feds, give them enough information to keep himself out of trouble, while at the same time pointing the finger at other people, all he wants, figuring that they could never come after him because of this king for a day deal. That they would be making cases against all of these accomplices that he's going to provide them names on, and they would be the ones to go down for these crimes, not him. So this meeting with Jason Scott was arranged. The two federal agents who had been working the stolen gun case were there, along with Jason and his defense attorney. Jason had 3 pieces of paper sitting on the table in front of him when the agents glanced down at these papers. There were more than 36 addresses listed on them. And then suddenly Jason admitted to the agents that these were the addresses of the homes that he had broken into, and on 9 of those occasions he specifically said he broke into the victim's home to wake them up, to hold a gun to their head, and from there he would proceed to burglarize them and their home. It was at that point the ATF agents started to feel like this home invasion case might actually be a bigger deal than their stolen weapons case, because of just how many burglaries Jason was saying he was involved in, and the fact that he admitted to some of these crimes being quite violent. It seems as if the ATF agents were under the impression that Jason Scott was going to use the opportunity to be king for a day to fess up to some of the stolen weapons charges. They didn't think he was going to spill on a whole bunch of armed home invasion robberies. And in this confession of the day, Jason also implicated Marcus Hunter, the person that he was arrested with by the ATF. Jason told the agents that this is how he and Marcus earned a living, pointing guns at people's heads and taking their valuables. And among the addresses Jason confessed to was the address of the Irvins, Lloyd and Vicky. We spoke about their ordeal at the beginning of this episode. Lloyd was the one who was skilled in martial arts and then managed to get away from one of the 2 suspects who had broken into their home. And as soon as the intruder lost control of the gun, he ran out of the house yelling to his accomplice that he's got the gun, he's got the gun. And that was one of the addresses Jason Scott had on his list. At this point, Jason not only thought that he was going to get away with all of these home invasion burglaries, he also thought that his accomplice would be the one to take the fall for the both of them. Jason figured that his part of the deal would be to testify against Marcus Hunter and point the finger at him for all the home invasions while he enjoys the benefits of his king for a day deal. So when the Prince George's County investigators heard about Jason Scott confessing to almost all of the home invasion burglaries that have been happening in their community, he began to rethink his initial assessment of Jason being this small, weak, soft-spoken person who he didn't see being involved with any type of violent crime. Maybe he was too quick to dismiss him. At this point, the investigators had already made a tentative link between the home invasions and the 4 murders, with that stolen Nissan key having actually gone missing in an earlier break-in. The homeowner and the owner of the Nissan Maxima hadn't noticed the spare key to the Nissan were missing until the Nissan actually went missing. Only then did she notice that her spare keys were missing. From there, it is believed that as a part of these home invasions, the burglars were stealing spare car keys for future use, which is what appears to have happened here with this Nissan. The keys were stolen a month in advance. 2 bodies wind up dead inside that very Nissan that was stolen earlier the same evening that it was found engulfed in flames. It was stolen just 24 hours after the murders had taken place. And everything was just happening in such close proximity to everything else. While the investigators on the home invasions were getting ready to close out all of their unsolved cases, the detectives on the 4 murders just happened to ask if they could have a copy of those addresses that Jason Thomas Scott provided to them in his King for a Day confession. While Jason Scott offered up that list of 40 addresses of the homes he confessed to breaking into, some of them quite violently, he also unknowingly gave the homicide investigators something very real to work with that they hadn't seen in a long time as they were trying their best to solve the Lofton and the DeWitt murders. Now, bear in mind that all of these locations are in very close proximity to one another, but there were some specific things that they were hoping to find out in mapping out Jason and Marcus's crime wave, these home invasions that they had, or at least Jason had confessed to. The thing that they had really been hoping for was to be able to link them to the home where the Nissan Maxima had been stolen from, and that would begin to close the gap between the home invasions and the murders. But of the addresses Jason Scott listed as being homes that they burglarized, the home where the Nissan Maxima was stolen from was not included on Jason's list, even though the location from where the Nissan was stolen fell right in the middle of all the home invasions. Jason left it off the list. Was this perhaps just another coincidence again? That Jason just so happened to leave off the house where the car was stolen from that ended up burning along with 2 bodies stuffed into the trunk? Or is it that he didn't include the address of the Nissan, knowing exactly how he could be linked to some much more serious charges if he were to have confessed to breaking into that home too, so he deliberately left it off his confession list? And while at this point it was still a tough sell, people who do home invasion burglaries as a criminal career choice don't always veer off into becoming serial killers. Now, we have talked about this most recently with the University of Idaho murder series that we just did. There is sometimes a progression for a criminal. They'll start off with what are described as nuisance type crimes, and what this does, it enables them to become comfortable breaking into someone's house. A burglar may not necessarily all of a sudden veer off into becoming a serial killer, but if the murders and the home invasions are related, then what we might be seeing here is the burglar getting very comfortable breaking into people's homes and using it as practice for what he ultimately wants to do, which is to escalate his criminal activity. Anyway, investigators were still not quite sure what to make of this possible connection to Jason Scott and the home invasions and the murders and tying everything together, but what they did have definitely piqued their interest. They were very much in need of a good lead, so what the homicide investigators with Prince George's County and the ATF agents decided to do was go ahead and pool their resources and work together on what they now believe was a pretty solid link between the crime wave of home invasions and 4 unsolved murders. For the newly formed task force, in speaking to people who may have known Jason Scott and various members of his family, nobody really had anything remarkable to say about him. And it seemed like the general consensus was that nobody really knew the guy all that well. Jason's home at some point in the investigation was searched, and when examiners got a look at some of the digital material that they found, it became obvious that Jason Scott was also a peeping Tom who took video of girls through their bedroom windows as he crept around the neighborhood. The videos they found made it clear just how disturbing this seemingly quiet and meek Jason Scott actually was and is. When it comes to peeping Toms, Jason Scott turned out to be one of the worst anyone involved in this case had ever seen. He had videos of young women getting dressed in their bedrooms, while he's standing outside the window with his camera taping all of this. This was in 2008 and 2009. People were still using digital cameras. I don't think this guy was using his phone to record these people. He also videotaped himself as he followed people around in the woods as they were walking or hiking. He was doing some very, very disturbing things. In order to try and get more information about Jason Scott, the homicide investigators wanted to speak to his accomplice, the one who was busted along with him by the ATF, Marcus Hunter. And at first, Marcus wasn't about to open up to the police about anything. But that might have something to do with people sort of being intimidated by Jason, despite his meek disposition. As investigators spoke to several people who were either acquaintances of or possibly even co-conspirators on some of the break-ins with Jason, whatever the case was, one of them said that Jason wasn't the type of person who would get mad and fight you right there on the spot. He's the type of guy who would get mad, sit on it for 2 weeks, and then go and set your house on fire in the middle of the night. They described him as pretty crazy. That's the type of stuff that Jason Thomas Scott would do. Anyway, over the course of the next few weeks following Jason's King for a Day deal, investigators were finding out more and more information about their now prime and only suspect. In fact, they got to know Jason Scott so well, they began to wonder about their own safety and the safety of their families and their homes. It's clear that Jason Scott spends time lurking and watching. What's to stop him from doing the same to any of the investigators working on his case? They were getting pretty anxious to get him off the street. They were dealing with a very dangerous and disturbing individual. And this is when the loophole in the King for a Day deal becomes quite useful. When investigators figured out that Marcus Hunter was Jason's accomplice in the home invasions, they decided to see if he might be able to be persuaded to talk to them more about Jason. Remember, before, Marcus Hunter had kept pretty tight-lipped about everything. But that was about to change when investigators let it be known to Marcus that Jason was spilling the beans and pointing the finger directly at him. Marcus. He's the one responsible for all the break-ins. That is when Marcus Hunter changed his mind about talking to investigators. When Marcus was asked about whether or not he knew of Jason to break into any houses just to take car keys, he said yeah. He talked about it a couple of times at a couple of jobs where he just went in and took the keys to just have them, just in case he needed the car sometime in the future. And it seems as though that's what may have happened in the case of the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt. The DeWitts were murdered. The Nissan Maxima was stolen and found with the bodies burning in the trunk of a driveway of a vacant house that was on sale the next day, 24 hours after they were murdered. The investigation revealed that sometimes Jason would leave a stolen car parked near a vacant house that was for sale. So they feel like they've made a pretty solid link between Jason and the DeWitt murders, which were the ones that happened 6 weeks after the first murders of Carissa and Karen. When it came to those first murders, the Loftons, investigators were also able to find a connection between them and Jason Scott, and it had to do with his vehicle. A neighbor reported seeing a dark blue sedan parked nearby the location of the Lofton murders at the time that it took place. And it just so happened that Jason drove a dark blue Toyota Camry. In addition to that, among the videos Jason Scott made, there was one video where the person taking the video appeared to be setting up his camera in order to carry out a sexual assault in the home of a mother and a teenage daughter. And as he was setting up his camera, it captured a glimpse of his face. And even though he had much of his face covered up, Jason Scott does have pretty distinctive large brown eyes with long eyelashes. It was obvious that the image captured in that video was Jason Thomas Scott, and he did sexually assault that victim. And it would be among the growing list of charges Jason would come to face. When investigators dug up that old sexual assault case file, one of the things the victim said to her attacker was that he didn't want to hurt them, that he was supposed to kill them, but he said that he didn't want to hurt them. Again, I think this has to do with Jason working himself up to committing murder. Of course, a lot of this evidence that they're finding floating around Jason Scott is hardly enough to get an arrest warrant for murder. All of it is circumstantial. Even put together, it's far from a rock-solid case. But investigators on the murders got somewhat of a break on the case that the ATF agents had against Jason and Marcus collectively. In that case, they had plenty of solid evidence, more than enough to convict the both of them. In going through some of the interviews that the ATF agents conducted with Jason, one of the things that he mentioned was a haunted house. It was an abandoned old home that Jason said during his King for a Day interview that he and his co-conspirators met at in order to split their earnings from the gun sales. They also brought and hid the stolen guns at that location as well. So investigators circled back to the 24 hours between the time Dolores and Ebony DeWitt were murdered to the time that their bodies were found burning in the trunk of that Nissan Maxima. They desperately wanted to know where the two victims had been during that time. They wondered if the hiding place could also be this so-called haunted house that Jason referenced. If they could find evidence there linking all these crimes together, they might just have enough to win a conviction. So the homicide investigators set out to see if they could figure out which house was this haunted house that Jason Scott had mentioned during his interview. They wanted to go and see it and search it on the off chance that they might find some evidence that could definitively link all of these crimes. And the loophole at this point is that, yes, they can't use information that Jason Scott gave to them in that deal, but if they investigated a lead and came up with any kind of brand new evidence, that doesn't fall under Jason's immunity cloak. That new evidence could very much be used against him, even if it was discovered using information that Jason Scott himself provided. The investigators eventually made their way out to that haunted house that Jason referenced. It was situated at the end of a long driveway in the woods. It was a mansion that was vacant and for sale, as was the house the Nissan Maxima was parked in front of and set on fire. This house could not have been in a more perfect location to go and do whatever crazy illegal things that people like to do. It was off the beaten path. It was at the end of a long driveway. There was nobody around. It looks like it's been sitting there for quite a long time, unoccupied. It definitely has these haunted house vibes. And at night, it's completely pitch black out there. The detective described it as Jason Scott's playground. Forensic crime scene analysts came to the property and conducted a thorough search. One of the items that was recovered outside of the house were the charred remnants of what appeared to be a blue sweater. If you remember, Ebony DeWitt's boyfriend said that after they had gone out to dinner and he took her home, he dropped her off and watched her walk inside, and he remembered her wearing a blue sweater that was one of her favorites. A little ways further up the path, where they found that charred piece of blue sweater, they also found some pieces of denim jeans, and those bits of jeans, upon an initial look, appeared to be similar to what was left of the jeans Ebony's mom, Dolores, had on when she was murdered. Mixed up in all of these were a bunch of dead leaves on the ground, so they wondered if those might be the same types of leaves that were found stuck to Dolores's body when her charred remains were examined. An arborist was called in and asked to identify the trees that surrounded this haunted house, and as soon as the expert drove up, he glanced at the tree and ID'd it as a beech tree, same as what was found on Dolores's remains. So now the investigators have an answer to where Ebony and Dolores were for those lost 24 hours between the time that they were killed and the time that they were set on fire. The case against Jason Scott did still need some more fine-tuning. So investigators turned their attention back to Jason's accomplice, Marcus Hunter. He had been eliminated as having any involvement in any of the murders. So when they went to talk to him, the investigators kind of insinuated that Jason Scott was spilling the beans And if of the two of them, Jason is the only one that's going to be doing the talking, then they're going to have to just wheel and deal with him, and they'll focus on building their case against Marcus Hunter. Well, that was about the time when Marcus decided that he was going to throw his full support behind the police and agreed to fully cooperate with their investigation. And the things that Marcus had to say about Jason confirmed for investigators that they were dealing with someone who was much scarier than anyone initially thought. So he said that about a month before Dolores and Ebony were murdered, he was lurking around and passing through some backyards in the neighborhood. So this would have been sometime in February of 2009, a few weeks before Karen and Carissa Lofton were killed. Marcus and Jason had just robbed a house, so they were making their getaway on foot through people's backyards when Jason suddenly stopped in the middle of the backyard of Dolores and Ebony. He saw Ebony through her bedroom window and began standing there staring at her. Marcus was feeling super awkward, and he finally told Jason that they just can't stand there all night like that they needed to get out of there. More damning information Marcus was able to provide on another night where they were committing a home invasion. It was also the night before Dolores and Ebony DeWitt were murdered. Marcus had given Jason a ride to his car. Jason had it parked someplace randomly, but nearby. When they arrived at the location of Jason's car, Marcus noticed that they were only a block away from the DeWitt home, just the night before they were murdered. Marcus also remembered in the days following the murders of the Loftons, or for a handful of days, he saw Jason numerous times in possession of a Glock 17 handgun, which was the weapon that was used to murder Karen and Carissa. They theorized that the Glock may have been stolen, so they ran a records check to see how many Glock 17 purchases had been made in the last couple of years that were registered to people in this area. Then they went down the list and contacted all of those registered gun owners to see if they were aware of the location of their weapon or if it was in anybody else's possession. It turned out that 13 days prior to the Loftons murders, a home in the area had been broken into and a Glock 17 was among the items stolen. And it just so happened that in the state of Maryland, they have this law that when they sell a handgun, they have to test fire it first and submit that shell casing to be put on the gun's file in case it is ever used in the future to commit a crime. The shell casings that were recovered from the Loftons murders were found to be an exact match to the shell casing that they had on file for that stolen Glock 17. In order to see if Marcus Hunter could actually place that Glock 17 into Jason's hands, what they did was take him to the area where the Glock was stolen from. And without telling Marcus anything else about the neighborhood or the gun or anything, they asked him if he and Jason ever broke into a house in that specific neighborhood. Marcus admitted to the detectives that they had. They'd only been there once, and they had only broken into one house. And Marcus pointed to the exact house where the homeowners reported the Glock 17 had been stolen in a break-in. That was the only house Marcus said that they broke into around there. And with that, investigators felt that they had all they needed to get a warrant to arrest Jason for murder. In the end, for all of his troubles, Marcus Hunter ended up with a 7-year sentence on the gun charges. Fortunately for the homicide investigators, they were going to have plenty of time to build as strong a case as possible against Jason because he was going to be facing all of those federal gun charges. A couple of months after the second mother-daughter murder, a gun shop in Woodbine, Maryland had been robbed, and it was as a result of information obtained from an informant. And because of that information, Jason Scott was arrested and his house was searched. He wasn't even really on the police radar in terms of the home invasions or the murders. It was discovered that Jason Scott had been working for UPS for more than 9 years, and it turned out he used his job as a way of casing people's houses and gaining access to their personal information. At the time that he was arrested on the federal gun charges, Jason was living with his parents and his sister, and it was at that house that it was subject to the search warrant that they had. Among the items seized included some computer files, a set of keys to a BMW, 12 guns, a police scanner, a silencer, and a bulletproof vest. Some of the items were identified as having been stolen during break-ins, and many of those break-ins were in the same neighborhoods as the murders. Also seized were a crowbar, gloves, and a ski mask. They also found a flash drive that had photos of a young female who was naked and had a pillowcase over her head. This is the video where the person holding the phone actually captured a quick image of himself, and I said that the eyes were so distinctive that it was very easy to identify Jason Scott as the person in that video. This is an incident, the sexual assault that occurred during another home invasion where there was only a teenage girl home at the time. The teenager's older sister and mom arrived home to find her being held at gunpoint. The details of the case are pretty thin, but apparently the intruder was able to maintain control of all three of the women. He ordered the younger sister into a bedroom where he filmed himself sexually assaulting her. Jason Scott was subsequently indicted on federal weapons charges and carjacking charges, as well as sex charges stemming from the evidence on the flash drive. The case against him was solid because Jason Scott was selling guns out of the trunk of his car, pistols, assault weapons, machine guns, and some silencers, and it was a sale of 4 of those guns for $3,000 to an undercover informant. That's what got Jason Scott busted. 3 of those weapons that he was selling had come from the gun shop that had been burglarized months earlier. An article I read called Jason Scott a brilliant criminal. Personally, I think that's giving the guy too much credit. It says that he studied forensic books and altered his modus operandi to try and throw investigators off. Jason Scott was apparently so well versed in forensic science techniques that he was able to clean up crime scenes and use his knowledge to confuse detectives and to deceive an FBI profiler into believing that the crimes weren't even connected. So it kind of sounds like the police department, the local law enforcement, they had it in their heads early on that the home invasions could possibly be connected to the murders. But once the FBI profilers theorized that the crimes were not related, that right there threw investigators off as well. It's been reported that Jason Scott had 2 master's degrees, one of them from the University of Maryland in Information Systems Management, and he may or may not be a quote-unquote smart criminal, but I will say this. He did manage to get away with stuff far longer than the guy charged with the University of Idaho murders, Mr. PhD. When I look at Jason Scott's picture, it doesn't exactly scream criminal mastermind. I kind of feel the same way about him and his education as I do the University of Idaho suspect, that it's all a prop. All of it to hide and cover up inadequacies in other areas of their lives. But for all of Jason's efforts, he definitely stumped investigators and managed to keep the evidence against him in the break-ins and in the murders to a minimum, to a point where he may have a slim chance of beating his case if he decided to take it to trial. As the investigation into Jason Scott carried on for about 3 more years, evidence was uncovered that potentially was linking him to a number of other unsolved crimes, including home invasion burglaries dating back to 2007. But then throughout this investigation, Jason Scott also came under suspicion for the June 2008 murder of Vilma Butler in the city of Bowie, Maryland. She had been shot inside her home, and then her house was set on fire. So, finally, in July of 2010, Jason Scott was charged with the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt, along with 2 counts of burglary. That was the strongest case that they had against Jason Scott when it came to the now 5 murders that he was suspected of. Well, in January of 2012, Jason was convicted on a whole bunch of counts of home invasion burglary and other related crimes and received a sentence totaling more than 100 years. In September of 2013, Jason Scott accepted an Alford plea deal from the prosecution for the murders of Dolores and Ebony. You all know the song and dance by now. This Alford plea was Jason allowing himself to be convicted by acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict him, but he doesn't exactly have to go on record as admitting to being guilty of anything. In exchange, they were going to drop the other 3 murder charges in the other 3 cases that they had been trying to link to Jason, Karen and Carissa Lofton and Vilma Butler. That really didn't sit well with the Lofton family, but the main goal for investigators was to do whatever they could to ensure that Jason Scott never walked free again. And that's basically what they got. They had to go with their strongest case. And in the end, Jason Scott was sentenced to 85 years in prison for the murders of Dolores and Ebony. With all the other prison sentences for all the other dozens of crimes that Jason's been convicted of, prison is exactly where Jason Thomas Scott will die. And that, my dreamers, was the tale of the mother-daughter killer, Jason Thomas Scott. Again, thank you so much for being patient with me in the month of July. It's actually been a really rough month in a lot of ways, not just because my life is in shambles, but also the weather has been miserable here. It's been over like 110 every day for like a week straight, and it's just been blah. But anyway, that's all I got for this week. I will be back very shortly. I'm going to start working on this collaboration on this mystery that I have for you guys. I got to get to Patreon. I only have 6 more days to go. Oh my God, the month is running away from me. All right, I'll wrap it up now. I'll let you all go. Get back to your lives. I'll be back in a couple of days with something new for you. And as always, until next time, sweet dreams.